So Chapter 12 is really divided into two halves. Did you start me, Joe? All right, so business cycles and unemployment. So we'll start with the business cycles, and then we'll move on to the unemployment in a little bit. Now, business cycles. There are 4 stages in the cycle of business. You can start at any one of them because the whole cycle means it's just going to repeat as it goes around. So it doesn't matter where you start, but whatever. The idea will be pretty clear once you see it, though. All right, so let's start. Let's see. We'll call it the recovery stage or the growth stage. The idea is, and I'm going to draw a picture for this, so I hope you guys don't mind. I know you've probably been jonesing for a week of no graphs, I know, so I'll fix you here. I'll give you a little picture. It's a model. So the idea is that the recovery stage of GDP is the stage where, as time passes, GDP is going up. But at some stage, the recovery ends, right? So it's shooting up and up and up and up, and maybe it started to finally slow down, but eventually it reaches its peak, which happens to be the second phase. That's where recovery basically ends. And once you've peaked, what does the definition of peak mean? You hit the top of the peak. Now you are going to start falling. This is your recession, or you start recessing. So that is your third stage. So GDP is now decreasing over time. And eventually, as you decrease, you will bottom out. And the quote-unquote bottoming out, don't ask me why they use this word, but it's the word they use. They call it a trough. That's actually a very mathematical term, actually. Part of a third derivative if you ever study saddle points. Sorry, I'm a nerd. And the trough is just where your recession ends. And what has to follow a trough? A new recovery stage. And hence, the cycle repeats. You will recover for a certain amount of time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe you had a good couple of years, but eventually you will then hit another peak. You will then recess for a little while, and you will hit a trough. And this will repeat ad nauseum. And this has been going on since we've started measuring GDP back in the early 10s to the 20s. This is a constant ebb and flow all right? So when you have recessions, you don't normally have to freak out as much as we have in the last few years because it is a natural part of the cycle, right? I mean, it's just eventually we can only grow for so long, right? Eventually we will have spent all the money that we can spend, and then what do we need to do? We need to save or pay off our bills, and in doing so, right? Because what happens when we quit spending money, right? When consumer spending starts to drop, well, product markets have less money. Businesses have less money. They lay people off. People have a little bit less money. Product market has less money. Businesses have less money. Businesses have to lay people off. That's what a recession's all about, folks. It's not a bad thing necessarily. It's just a correction, right? because we were perhaps growing too fast earlier, and now we've just slowed back down. We've taken a recovery stage. We're paying off our bills a little bit. We're just waiting before we can start growing again. The problem with it, of course, is that this circle tends to sort of point out that once you get into this circular flow going down, it's a little scary, right? It may keep going. It may last 3 or 4 years or 3 or 4 quarters like we had back in 2008, 2009. That's the longest recession we've had since the 30s, right? Prior to 1930, we haven't had a recession last more than 3 quarters ever. And ours lasted, 5.5? Scary, scary business. That's why they actually called it the Great Recession, right? That's what the 2008, 2009 recession was called. Like the Great Depression, but just not as bad. Most people have called it the Great Recession. Depends on which news, channel you listen to and whether or not the president is from the correct party or not, etc. But the fact remains is that that's why they actually named it something, because it was actually a relatively long recession, right? Normally, these are more, 3-4 months worth of recession. They're not 3 or 4 quarters. They're not really long, all right? And hopefully, what's been going on with GDP, right? If you kind of take the average of all of this stuff, what's going on to GDP? This nice sort of slow, steady growth. Now, yeah, we're going up and we're going down and we're going up and we're going down, but overall, if you look over the path of GDP over the last 50 years, this growth on average is considered around 3.5% from year to year. So they expect this slope of this line to be about 3.5%. And that's why everyone right now is saying that we haven't recovered, because GDP right now, it's growing, but it's not growing 3.5% on top of what it was last year. And that's why everyone's saying that we haven't truly recovered. But from a strict economics perspective, we recovered back in 2010, folks. 2010, we have seen growth in GDP for, 9 out of the last 10 quarters, which is, under normal circumstances, considered a recovery. We should be, quote unquote, recovered. But the problem with it is that we haven't gotten back to this average growth rate of 3.5% on top each year. And that's why we, as economists, are kind of like, we're not really recovered yet. Because we're growing, but our slope is much lower, right? Is that a bad thing? Well, I don't know. It kind of depends on what you think, but it's part of the game, all right? Now, so the question then is, when do these things happen, and how can we guess when they happen? I mean, wouldn't that be nice to know? Well, what economists use to make their best guesses are these things. We call them economic indicators. So as you listen to economic news or you read economic news, they will start banding around certain terms or certain concepts. And if you take a peek on, what page is that, Jeremy? 254 in your text, you will see a large number of them. I do not want you to memorize these, okay? All right. But what I want you to know is to understand the difference between these things, right? So there's 3 types of indicators. Give yourself room to define them. So the first type that we tend to talk most about are leading indicators, and these are predictors. So if you take a peek at some of those in there, right, so the average work week, unemployment claims, so there's one of the classic ones. Unemployment claims, these are the new unemployment claims, right, that's one of the huge statistics that they've been quoting around over the last, 2 or 3 years because of unemployment being such a big deal. Note stock prices. So the Dow Jones Industrial Average. When we see the Dow Jones rise, we don't expect GDP to grow right now, but we do expect it to grow sometime in the very near future, which is again why economists tend to look at the Dow Jones so tightly, is as a predictive value for what GDP is going to do. All right? Now, your question is probably, well, how soon is soon? If I knew how soon was, folks, I would not be teaching in this class, folks. I would be sitting in Tahiti, owning an island, sipping a drink out of a little umbrella of some sort, and being an extremely wealthy millionaire, billionaire, trillionaire type person. How quickly these things predict is unsure. And again, which ones of these are best? Is it better to use unemployment claims? Is it better to use stock prices? Is it better to use consumer expectations? Right. I mean, which ones of those are the most important? Again, most economists have their own few that they tend to like most, and those are the ones that they tend to use. And when those numbers go up, they say, ooh, GDP is going to go up next quarter. And some of the other economists will use different ones, and they'll say, no, ours didn't go up, so it's not going to. And that's why they disagree, because everybody's got their own different leading indicators. All right? My personal favorite one, just so that you know, is the consumer confidence interval, or the consumer confidence index. Basically, there is a think tank. What they do every 6 days, 6 to 7 days, basically every week, is they call up 30,000 people, and they don't just use like regular landline phones. They actually have incorporated cell phone numbers into this, but they call up 30,000 random people in the country and ask simple question: how much money are you going to spend next week compared to last week? If it's more, you get a little +1. If it's less, you get a little -1. If you say the same, you get a 0. After they call those 30,000 people up, they add all the numbers up. If the number, and then they divide by 30,000. Whatever the percentage is, that's what the consumer confidence index is. That has been the best predictor over the last 35 years for what GDP is going to do three months out. Yeah, you would think it would be this high-tech computer model, right? No, it's some dork on the phone calling 30,000 people and waiting until he gets an answer from 30,000 different people, more, less, same, and then adding them up. And they literally do it by a little tally mark. You don't even put it in a computer. It's great. I love it. Anyways, but you see why consumer confidence would be a factor, right? I mean, what's the biggest component of our GDP? Consumer spending. So when consumers spend more, what happens? More money goes into the product market, more money goes to the businesses. What do businesses do with more money? Hire more people getting hired, hence the circle flowing in the good direction, not the bad one. So most of these indicators are that kind of a thing, right? If you think about stock prices, why would stock prices be an indicator, right? Well, when the value of my stock goes up, what do I do when all of a sudden I look like I have a lot of money? I start spending more. I start investing more. Once there's more investment money out there, businesses say, ooh, I've got more investment money. I can start growing now. I can start building new factories. Hence, I have to hire more people. Whew, same sort of thing. The money is getting into the economy in some fashion that's forcing it to flow. All right, so again, these are the predictors. Please don't memorize those things. I mean, unless you want to come up with your own set of economic predictors and you want to use them to do some analysis, then cool, by all means. These indicators at the same time as GDP. So in other words, as these numbers are going up, usually GDP is going up at the same time as well. Or if these numbers are going down, GDP is going down at the same time as well. So the idea behind it here is that these coincident indicators, when you want to say that a recession is happening or is going to be happening at some stage, right? You look to your predictive values. If those indicators said they're going down, 2 or 3 months later, you're going to start looking at these indicators, these coincident ones, and say, are these going down? And if they are, you're expecting GDP to be going down at the same time, right? Remember that GDP is a tough thing to measure fluidly, right? So there will be times where GDP looks like it drops, and then 3 days later it'll hop back up, and then it'll drop back down, and then hop back up. And so you want to have an idea of when GDP is dropping, is it really dropping, or is there just a burp in the system for a moment and it's going to go back to where it was a second ago or 2 or 3 days from now? These indicators are the things that you look to see if what's currently happening to GDP is a shift or it's just a burp. All right? And my favorite one of this is actually is the industrial production, right? So these industrial orders. So when I hear them saying that industrial orders are going down and GDP is going down at the same time, I'm like, that's a bad sign, all right? Because that's a shift in GDP leveling out or falling even in my world, right? And then last but not least, the lagging indicators. And these are the verifying indicators, or these values change after GDP. And again, they tend to be called the verifying indicators. So when these lagging indicators go down, it's usually because GDP has already fallen. And likewise, these numbers, when they're going up, they're only going up because GDP has already gone up. Classic one for this one in my book is the unemployment rate itself. So the actual percentage that we have is a lagging indicator. It's why I tend to get really pissed off when people only talk about the unemployment rate and not more about the actual number of physical unemployment claims. Because it takes a while for businesses to get enough capital built up to decide they need to hire new people, right? So imagine, if you will, that consumer confidence is on the rise. Consumers are spending money, right? So we're spending. Don't ask us why. We're just doing it. Eventually we spend. The money finally gets into the product market, and there's more industrial orders going on out there, right? So businesses see that their inventories are dropping, so they say, wait, hey, Alcoa, go produce a whole bunch of new products for me. Hey, Stoughton Trailer, make a whole new set of trailers for me, et cetera, et cetera. How long does it take before Stoughton Trailers and Alcoa start hiring people, though? Takes them a while, right? Because what do they do first? Once they get a big, huge order, what does a business do? Yeah, the first thing you do is you up all the people who are part-time, you pull them to full-time. Once you have all your part-time people full-time, do you hire people next? You push them into overtime, right? You say, ooh, you're working a 40-hour week, now you need to work a 50-hour week. And of course, since it was just a recession a little bit ago, what do you guys say to a 50-hour week? Ooh, yeah, overtime, 50% on top, right? You're thinking, we're not eating mac and cheese this week, we're eating, hamburger helper, yeah. So, and again, that keeps happening, right? Suppose people keep spending. Businesses still need to produce more product. They're pushing you to a 60-hour week, right? Again, yeah, you're kind of tired, but you're also swimming in money or hamburger helper. And, and you're like, wow, wouldn't it be nice to actually have some steak? So you put in those 60-hour weeks, but how long are you going to put in a 60-hour week? You can go a lot longer than you think you can, all right? Hell yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah, and again, it's hiring, but once we get to the unemployment section, you'll see that unemployment, hiring part-time workers is good enough. The fact remains, though, is that the business is going to do everything it possibly can before it hires new people, right? Because new people are expensive. I mean, there's the learning curve. How long does it take before they become productive? There's the insurance curve, which is huge right off the bat because workers are expensive, right? I mean, wages are nothing compared to how much they have to pay in insurance for you, right? It's mostly the women's fault. If women would just quit working, it would be all good. You and your reproductive system. That's a joke, by the way, folks. But that is part of what happens, right, is dealing with the insurance and the taxes and then needing to hire more HR people to take care of you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, hiring people is extremely painful. If you can avoid it, a business will avoid it until the very bitter end. Right? And usually they're not going to start hiring people until those people that are working 60 hours a week actually start quitting. That's normally what it takes. I mean, so when you see and hear about people who have quit their 60-hour-a-week job because they found a 40-hour-a-week one that was reasonable, that's what indicates, okay, the true recovery has hit, right? Because once they quit, then Stoughton Trailer or Alcoa has to say, oh, crap, you know, we got to hire 2 people to make up for the 1 person who quit, right? And even then, those 2 people probably won't be able to cover the 1 person who quit for, 4 to 6 months. That's hard. Right? But again, this is really what businesses have to be told, right? And it's a hard choice to make, right? I mean, epic, 3 or 4 years of 60-hour weeks before I could finally say, and then move on to the next one, right? I mean, it takes a lot of work. All right, so know the 3 different indicators and what they mean, all right? Again, leading indicators, these are things that are going to make change, right? They're going to predict the change of GDP. Coincident indicators are indicators that are changing with GDP. So if I'm telling you that a coincident indicator is changing, your response to me should be that GDP is changing the same direction. And lagging indicators, those are things that change after GDP. So if I tell you a lagging indicator is either going up or down, you tell me that GDP has already done that. All right? All right. Now, I think those are the end of our business cycles. All right, so business cycles, really, it's know the 4 stages, know what the 3 indicators are. That's really all there is to the business cycles, okay? And that really takes us to the end of our analysis of GDP. Okay? So all of these indicators, really, it's a goal of what's going on with GDP, because that's the first goal. So, since we're done with the first goal, we have to move to the second goal, full employment. Again, folks, full employment is a pipe dream. There is no way that you could literally have 100% of our workforce working at all times. Even for 1 second, it would be almost impossible. All right? So bear with it to some degree. Now, before we even get into describing, full employment and what unemployments there are, you should know, how is unemployment determined? First and foremost, and this is hard for people to wrap their brains around sometimes, is that unemployment is not defined by whether or not you're getting an unemployment check, okay? They are totally separate things. They have nothing to do with each other at all. In fact, there are 2 separate divisions of the government that do both of those 2 different things. The people who pay for your unemployment, the people who calculate unemployment, they are in 2 different cities. They don't talk to each other. They don't even know each other, okay? So, again, whether or not you get an unemployment check has nothing to do with whether you actually really are unemployed. Right? I know lots of people who are employed and getting unemployment checks, okay? So, bear that in mind. So, the way we calculate the unemployment rate is that we take the number of unemployed people in the system, and again, I will define what it means to be unemployed in a little bit, and we divide by what's called the civilian labor force. This is supposed to represent all of the employable people in the country. It doesn't do a very good job. And we want this to be a percentage, so you multiply by 100% so that it's a percent. Okay? All right, so first things we have to do So we need to essentially we need to define what all of these things are, first off. Okay, so let's start with the definition of unemployed. Employed/unemployed. Unemployed. Okay, so when the government goes to determine whether or not you are employed or unemployed, first of all, folks, it is done by doing a survey, just like the Consumer Confidence Index, right? The way the government calculates it is they call up, 50 to 60,000 people in the area and ask them this question, all right? They ask them, first off, they ask them whether or not you worked for pay at least 1 hour last week. 1 hour, that's all it takes. If you worked 1 hour in a week for pay, yes means you're employed. Period. The unemployment rate, folks, has nothing to do with the underemployment rate. Those are two totally separate different things. Again, unemployed just means that you didn't work at all. 1 hour, that's all it takes. If you worked 1 hour for pay, you were considered employed. Done. All right? Now, if you say no, they ask you a second question. Right, so the second question is, did you work more than 15 hours not for pay? In other words, did you, put in a 15-hour week volunteering? Did you put in a 15-hour week at the family restaurant where they needed somebody to bust dishes or wait tables and you didn't get paid because your mom and dad are a bunch of cheapskates? If you say yes to that, you are employed. You didn't get paid a red cent, but you were still employed because you worked. Therefore, you were employed. If you say no, they ask you another question. It's tough to get. You got to say yes to get out of the question loop. Yeah. Did you look for work last week? This is why people tend to think that the unemployment rate and whether or not you get an unemployment check are the same, because they still ask you this question, right? Again, it's being asked by someone totally different. If you say no to this and say yes to the other person from the unemployment office who gives you the money, you're still going to get paid, period, all right? Because they're totally separate things. But the fact is that did you look for work last week? If you say yes here, you are considered unemployed. If you say no, you are removed from the civilian labor force, which is what this thing is up here. Basically, you're taken out of the numbers. You don't count. You're neither employed nor unemployed. So here is the government's definition for what it means to be employed or unemployed. Work an hour. That's all it takes. And this 15, it might also be 10. It kind of depends on 10 to 15 hours, whatever, one of those. Once you put in enough volunteer work, if you put in enough, you're working, folks. Therefore, you're employed. You don't even have to get paid a penny, and you're still employed, according to the government.
So, I have a very part-time job.
Doesn't matter.
I work 14 hours a week.
That's enough.
That's enough?
Oh, yeah. All I got to do is work one. One. Not for pay, yeah. I mean, as soon as you're getting paid, if it's 1 hour, you're done. You're employed, sorry. You're making the numbers look good. Good job. Right? That's all it takes. 1 flippin' hour. So you would wonder, how can the unemployment rate be so high, right? I mean, if all you have to do is work 1 hour. And note, folks, if you didn't at least look, you're removed from the numbers. Now, why do they do this? No. Think about it from the real world perspective. Who are these people who say no to this last question? Who said no to everything else? Yeah, the retired people, right? I mean, imagine if you're retired. You're older than 16 years old. You're 65. Did you work for pay? No. Did you do any volunteer work? Not enough. No, I'm 65. Screw that crap. Did you look for work last week? Hell no, I'm retired. I'm getting paid Social Security. Screw you, right? So, I mean, the whole point is that these are supposed to be the retired people, right? Or, I mean, think about it. A friend from college who started his own internet business in the 90s. Sold it in 1997 for like $120 million. 40, guess what? He's flipping retired, right? He's living down on an island in Florida, just earning interest on his investments. He's retired. He's one of these guys that says, no. Granted, I would strangle him if he showed up in this building anywhere, but, you know, again, should he be working? Well, yeah, but should he be considered unemployed? What? No, because he's not trying to work, so he shouldn't be considered unemployed, right? So it's actually a good thing, right, to remove the retired people from the... They shouldn't be there. The problem, of course, is that once you have unemployment last for, say, a year or more, what do you start finally doing after you've been unemployed for a year or two? Get a little discouraged, maybe? Get a little pissed off, maybe? Bother to look for work next week? Screw that, I'm just going to go beg out in the front corner and see if that works. Why not? Give it a try. You've heard stories about these people that are begging in L.A. and New York getting $30,000 a year from just standing on the corner putting their head out, right? Maybe it'll work for you. I don't know. Right? So the problem with it, right, is that these are what are often called discouraged workers. If the worker is not truly retired, okay? And depending on whether you're trying to make the current administration look good or bad, you can make this number as big or as small as you want, right? That's one of those where they would probably say they were employed, right? I mean, if you're selling on the street corner, I mean, come on. That's employed, right? Didn't they? And they got paid, right? I mean, maybe they got paid in product, but they still got paid. All right, so the fact remains is that this is the definition. All right, so right off the bat, you're looking at it going, whoa, what the... Now, on top of it, what does it mean to be in the civilian labor force? How do we define that to start with, right? Because actually, before they start asking you this question, they actually ask you a couple of lead-in questions first. So, first of all, to be in the labor force, you got to be more than 16 or more. So if you're 15 years old, you don't count. If you're looking for work, doesn't matter. If you are, still doesn't matter. You are not counted. You are not affecting the numbers, right? So if you guys got kids that are under 16 and they got a job, they are not helping our unemployment rate in any way, shape, or form. Sorry. Right? Should they? again, how do you determine what 15-year-olds should and what 15-year-olds shouldn't? I mean, should you just count the ones that are working? Well, but then that would discount all the ones that are trying to find work but can't. Or a 15-year-old has really tried to find work but can't. Amen. That's why they came up with these questions, right? So this was their goal, right, was to try and come up with a question that was, in theory, as close as they could get, right?
16-year-old's going to be an honest person, but a 15's not?
Apparently. Or a 16-year-old knows whether or not they need to work, whereas a 15-year-old doesn't. Somehow one day makes a difference. Regardless, though, they have to make a line somewhere, right? I mean, so that they can start counting, right? So this is the first line. First, you got to be 16 years or older. If you're not 16, you're not counted, period, all right? Okay, the other thing that they ask, this is a civilian labor force, civilian. No active duty. As soon as you are on active duty, you are removed from the civilian labor force. You do not affect unemployment numbers in any way, shape, or form. Are people who are in active duty working? Should they be counted, though? Well, but this whole working, this is whether that they can be a part of our civilian labor force. I mean, are people who are in the Army civilians? So should we redefine how it's been cranked out and add all of the people in the Army? Maybe should. And if we did, what would happen? If you added, 1.2 million working individuals, what would happen to the unemployment numbers? It shoots way the hell down, folks. Why don't they add them? I mean, if you were the President of the United States, why would you not include all of those people who are in the armed forces right now? Unemployment rate would look, right now it's what, 7%? It would probably drop to 5.5. Add 1 million working people, because everybody who's in active duty, they're working, they're getting paid, right? They don't even have to pay tax while they're working, right? Bastards. Yeah, most of them, right? I mean, most of what they're doing is infrastructure work, right? So anyways, though, this, right, could make unemployment better, right? One of the other things that they ask you, are you a full-time student? If you are a full-time student, you are not in the civilian labor force. You are actively seeking an education, therefore you are not actively seeking a job. We will take you out. Doesn't matter. As soon as you're a full-time employee, as soon as you're a full-time student, you are out of the civilian labor force. Doesn't count. Yep. I mean, you still have to live, unfortunately, but from an employment perspective, if you're a full-time student, your goal is not to be working, according to the government. You can tell them that. I don't think it's going to help much. Well, you can tell them that you don't count. He might agree with you there. All right, but full-time students are also removed from the calculation. All institutionalized people are removed from the calculation. So if you are in the big house, you are not part of the labor force, right? If you are, if you're institutionalized at a, some sort of a mental institution, also removed from the labor force. Right? Again, even if you have a job, right? Even if there are companies out there that are trying to hire people who have, mental issues, doesn't matter. As soon as you are constitutionally stated as institutionalized, you're now removed from the system.
So like the people that are in jail, like do like the work release or whatever, they
Don't
don't count.
count. May as well be in the Army. We'll leave that alone. Again, it's just a matter of the what is and what isn't considered a part of the workforce. Let's see. Oh. if you are legally considered disabled, you are also actually removed from the workforce. So if you're getting disability checks, again, you're not a part of the labor force, folks. You're not adding or subtracting for other numbers, depending on whether you are or are not working. All right? And what this points out is how much variance there really is in those unemployment numbers. Right? Anybody who wants to be a dick can play with any of these group of people and say, well, if you think that the unemployment rate is high and it should be lower, here's your argument for why it should be. The government doesn't count active duty individuals. If we would add the 800 to 1.2 million people who are in the active duty, the unemployment rate would be 5.5%. Why is everybody bitching? At the same time, if you are one of those people who thinks the unemployment rate's higher, you could say, oh, the unemployment rate ignores all of the discouraged workers who have quit looking because they've just been unemployed too long and they're just tired of dealing with it. The unemployment rate should really be higher, right? Basically, the unemployment rate was meant to have arguments, period, right? If you ever want to have an argument with someone, start talking about unemployment. All you have to do is wait for whichever one they think, you can now argue the other side. Doesn't matter whether you believe it or not, you can just be a dick, right? Sometimes that's beautiful at a party, right? If all you want to do is just walk in there, you go to the party and you're like, there's, maybe what they're serving isn't very good and you're just kind of pissed off anyways, and so, you want to have a fight. Here's how you can start it. Real easy. I mean, because anybody can start, well, they don't include full-time students, and I know everybody at Blackhawk Tech who's a full-time student at least is working 5 hours on the side. They should all be employed, right? But they're not, because they're full-time students. They're ignored. So part of this is the knowledge of how we calculate it, and part of it is also the ability for you to be pissed off if you want to. Anytime, right? Because someone's going to have opinion one way or the other. And now you can have the opposite at will. And that's really handy when you want to have a fight. It's nice. Right? Always, just keep this one in your back pocket at any time, because you can always get into an argument with someone about it. All right, so again, please know how we determine whether you're employed and what it takes to actually be even calculated, right? I mean, first of all, you got to be more than 16. You got to not be active. You got to be not full-time. You can't be crazy, and you can't be disabled. Well, that kicks about half of us out, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but I should be institutionalized. But all right, so it's a good thing and a bad thing, but at the same time, the reason that we are not trying to actively change it is because it's too hard to determine when is someone discouraged versus retired. Right? When should we allow the active duty people in there? Because in general, the reason why we stuck with civilian labor force is most of the active duty was meant to be overseas, working somewhere outside of the country. If they're working outside of the country, are they affecting our GDP? No. Right? It's only in the recent years that we've had sort of the active duty actually doing work here, right? Fixing, floods and acts of God left and right? Because we're getting more of them because we need them. Or deserve them, whichever way you want to look at it. So the unemployment rate, it's probably one of the least understood and the worst used things in the entire economic industry right now. Anybody that's using it for any basis of any kind of argument, they're really just looking to pick a fight. That's their point, right? Because they know whatever you're going to say, they can say the opposite. Well, now you can too. All right, so that's how it's calculated. Now, the question then is, assume, if you will, that we go through this whole calculation and we determine that you are unemployed, right? So you didn't work an hour, you didn't do any volunteer work, and yeah, you actually did look. Well, look, regardless of whether you're honest or not, who cares, right? So how do we classify you after we discover that, yes, you are one of these unemployed people? All right, so actually, the phone interview doesn't end after you say, yes to this third question and you become unemployed. They actually ask you a few more questions to try and classify where you fit, because there are 3 types of unemployment. So the first type is frictional unemployment. And these are just the between jobs unemployment. So you're a contractor and you contracted to build, 800 windows in a housing development, and you told them, well, it's going to cost you, $25,000 and it's going to take me 6 months to do it. And they say, great, we'll have the structures built for you. You can start on, March 10th. And so you show up on March 10th, you do, 6 months worth of work. Do you finish your job, your last 800th window on exactly 6 months from March 10th? You should, but how often does that happen? Never? Yeah, okay, it never does. So you may finish early, you may finish late, but the fact remains, are you going to have a job lined up for yourself right after you're done? You hope so, right? But probably not. And these people, as soon as their job is done, if they haven't found a job, a new contracting job afterwards, folks, they're on the unemployment dole already, okay? As soon as that job is done, they fill out the unemployment claims and they start getting paid unemployment right after they're done. And then they start looking, right? So they will keep looking for contract work. And, the contract people will say, well, yeah, I can hire you in November. And he's like, okay. I mean, what's he going to do until November? Collect unemployment, right? But eventually, as soon as they start the job, in theory, the unemployment checks stop, right? I mean, they're supposed to. Unless, of course, the job he's working for is cash under the barrel. But that would never happen, right? Because nobody in the industry would ever be illegal and do something against the law, right? Just like none of you would ever do it, or me either. We would never, ever break the law, ever. Especially since we're on tape. All right, so this is seasonal unemployment. Right, so if your expertise is, Christmas window designs, right, you can only work about 9 months out of the year, because that's how long Christmas lasts. Starts in about June and goes until about February, right? Anyways, that's frictional unemployment.
Would those be like seasonal employees as well?
Yeah, yeah, like the people that pick fruit and stuff like that and can only do it in the winter. Yeah, right. Yeah, seasonal employees are also like roofers, right? It's kind of hard to do the roof when there's snow on top of it, And it's fun to watch, not to try. All right, so the next one is structural unemployment. Yeah. So structural unemployment is where skills of workers do not match skills of jobs. So yes, after most of the people here at GM were laid off, they were considered structurally unemployed because unfortunately the jobs that they had, which were how to work the line at a car factory, were not overly transferable out into the quote-unquote real world once they got there, right? No, they screwed the wrench thing, right? Until they got the pneumatic ones, and then they had to pull a trigger. That's different than pushing a button. All right, most economists agree that this is the worst kind of unemployment. This is the kind of unemployment that can last a long time. This stuff, it's bad, but it's not really bad because you have the skills to do work. You just can't quite find the work right now, all right? Or maybe you have, 2 or 3 months before your work starts because you have to wait for other people to do their part of the job first. That kind of stuff, right? You have the skills, but you just can't find the job, right? Maybe you have to move, what have you, that kind of stuff. Here, if you don't have the skills, what do you got to do? You got to get retrained. And how long does the retraining take? If you're clever, it could only take a year or two. If you're not so clever,
Some of them cannot be retrained.
yeah, and we've had some come through here, right? That I have spent a great deal of time trying to help them become numerate again. Yeah, it's tough, right? To readjust to the world. I mean, imagine if you've been screwing in a lug nut for 30 years, and now you have to punch keys on a keyboard, right? I look at my father-in-law, who's got fingers that are the size of sausages, right? Because he's worked on a farm his entire life, and I'm like, how could he work a typewriter? Right? I mean, we bought him the biggest frickin' typewriter you could possibly imagine, because all he does is hunt and peck anyways. So we got him one with the biggest keys available, right? And he can actually, he's actually started to learn to type, right? I mean, it's taken, yeah. But he's almost savvy enough that we would let him work on the computer alone. Right, my mom, I still can't get her to feel comfortable enough to do it. She just can't, right? So it's like, well, in today's day and age, if you can't use a computer, how employable are you? That's tough, right? So this is scary, right? And this is what we saw in the U.S. back in 2008, 2009. This is where most of our unemployment was, and this is what made a lot of the economists extremely nervous. And most of us agreed that, yeah, this is going to last a while because it's going to take a lot of work. And the question is, does the workforce have the... I mean, one of the reasons why the unemployment rate has been dropping so relatively nicely over the last 5 years is that a lot of those people who are untrainable into the new workforce are now 62 and can start pulling Social Security and have quit looking. They have dropped out of the unemployment numbers.
It's the same, probably added to that is the new workers that are 16 and they are trainable.
Right. I mean, those are, the hope, right, is that the 16-year-olds actually are trainable, right, that we could, after we get the big, huge lead pipe and, beat the crap out of them. And we're kids, Anyways, this is one of the scarier ones that can be out there. But again, it's one of those where, your economy has to adjust, right? This is also where the whole technology boom has been a bit of a issue for us, right? Is getting the ability to train people who have not been in training a long time. All right, so what's the last one, cyclical? Yeah. Cyclical unemployment. This is unemployment from a recession. So this is one where, again, you have the skills, you have the ability, but unfortunately the demand is not there, right? And remember that how does it tend to work when a company goes to lay people off? Who do they lay off first? The newest people, right? First in, first out type, last in, first out type of thing. So if you change jobs right before a recession started, what happens to you right after you change jobs and then 6 months later the economy tanks, right? Oh, it was nice having you. Sorry, right? So you are cyclically unemployed. You have the ability to be employed. Again, it's just one of those where once the economy recovers or you move to a place where there isn't as bad of an unemployment problem, you will probably be employed. Again, it's bad, it's not good, but it's also cyclical. And the nice thing about a cycle is that it ends, right? At some stage, the recession stops, we hit the trough, we get into the recovery stage. Once we are far enough into the recovery stage, those who are cyclically unemployed generally will get employed again. All right. The question, though, is that if you are cyclically unemployed long enough, what ends up happening to your skills? They deteriorate, and you move from being cyclical to being structural. And this is why long-term unemployment is bad, because any long-term unemployment, almost guaranteed, you are in the structural stage. You need some kind of training. You need some sort of a boost, some sort of a change in order to get you into a position where you will work, all right? And this is the sort of thing that in theory, politicians should focus on, and more often than not, it's just economists. And all we do is whine, so it doesn't really help much. But we point it out, and then it's up to the powers that be as to whether or not it should be changed. All right, no, I mean, it's getting better, right? I mean, you've seen a lot more of the political words that are being spoken now about retraining the people that are out there, or getting training for the younger, group that are coming through. Because a lot of the younger people that are coming through that perhaps haven't excelled at high school education maybe would find an advantage in coming someplace like here to get some sort of an associate's degree and get them moving towards something that is going to be advantageous, or where they won't run into a structural problem later on. Right? So sometimes it works. So all this hype about unemployment, right? It's one of the numbers that we throw around more often than not. It's the one that we scream about more often than not. Anybody that's that's pissed off about any of the political situations that they're sitting in will often bring up the unemployment rate, always, right? And again, they will often try to make it look bigger because, of course, that's how it makes the current situation look uglier. So why, though? Why is it such a big deal? Why do we harp on it? No money coming in or going out. Yeah. But it's the same. I mean, if you think about it from a productivity perspective, how different is it that an unemployed person is doing nothing versus a CEO who sits around and does nothing? I mean, what does a CEO do? He goes to meetings, then he goes to meetings, and then he goes to another meeting. Discusses numbers, goes to a meeting, and discusses more numbers. Walks around in a tie or a power suit of some sort, looks impressive. What do? Do they really guide the company? Do they get down into the workforce and tell people you need to do this and you need to do that? What are they doing? How productive are they being? How different are they than these people who are unemployed? Well, they're paying a lot of taxes, so they have to be better, right? Well, the reason that economists complain is because of this, the GDP gap. Or the lost GDP that the company or the country could produce if people were working. Is that the same thing? Sometimes I lurk when I work. All right, now, just because it's fun, and it never hurts to review, consumer goods and capital goods. What kind of a model am I going to draw up here? A PPC. What's a PPC? A production possibilities curve. And what does it look like? And why does it bow out? What causes it? Question number 8 on the multiple choice. What causes the production possibilities curve to bow out? Right, so the more you try and force someone to do something, the harder it is for them to do it, right? So what's that called? So it has to deal with opportunity cost. This is bowed out because of the law of increasing opportunity cost. Right. Again, the idea being the more you try and force people to be a farmer, the more they're going to hate being a farmer. Or the more you try and make someone work in a factory, the more they're going to hate working in a factory. But the idea is that here is our actual possible production possibilities curve, right? This is our, if everyone was working and all of our factories were working and all of our land was being utilized, etc. Again, what are our three resources? Land, labor, capital. So if we're utilizing all of our land, all of our labor, and all of our capital, this is how much GDP we would make. Unfortunately, this is how much we really make, right? So in theory, if everybody was working, our GDP could be $20 trillion. But unfortunately, our GDP is only $16 trillion. And this gap, unused resources, right? So you will definitely, I've actually heard it on the radio a few times driving down here, listening to different NPR stations, where they talk about the GDP gap, right? And they say that literally the country is pissing away $3 to $4 trillion a year of productivity because we are either unemployed or not utilizing all of our resources, right? If we could just take every piece of land that was doing nothing and make it do something, wouldn't that be better? So let's take all that land in Alaska and start drilling for oil. Take all that land in northern Wisconsin and let's mine for iron ore. All right, anyways, that's the last topic in chapter 12. All right, so a little bit of homework for chapter 12. Let's see. Should I be nice to you guys? All right, let's do 4, 6, and 10. So homework, chapter 12. 4, 6, and 10. Page, what was that again? 267. I was going to make you do number 2 as well, but I'll pass. That's a graphing one. I'll be nice. It's curves, though. You guys get to do dot to dot. You guys would like that. Joe?
So will our quiz on Wednesday be over 11 and 12?
Yes, quiz on Wednesday is over, chapters 11 and